Hello everyone, today I want to talk about how the US looks strong on the outside but is actually weak inside, and how the negotiations with Japan are a complete mess. Also, Iran is now being slaughtered by Israel, and the whole world should take this as a warning. This is a vivid example of how being pro-America can actually harm a country. The situation in the Middle East has taken a sudden turn for the worse. Just as nuclear negotiations between Iran and the US were deadlocked, Israeli forces launched a surprise attack on Tehran, the capital of Iran, in the early hours of June 13. Local residents were jolted awake by deafening explosions. People were shocked to see multiple buildings in Tehran engulfed in flames, marking the beginning of Israel's assault on Iran.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a televised address, announcing Operation Lion Strength, targeting Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile facilities.
After the attack, Iranian state media confirmed that the chief of staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, Bagheri, the commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Salami, as well as a senior military official and a nuclear expert, were all killed by Israel. With Israel taking out the leaders of two of Iran's armed forces, how badly has this hit Iran? The fact that Israel had such precise knowledge of the positions of Iran's top commanders shows that Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, has already deeply infiltrated Iran's inner circle. Given this situation, the atmosphere in Iran is filled with a sense of vengeance, symbolized by the raising of the red flag over the Khan Mosque. But can this really change the bigger picture? Iran's attack on Israel happened right at a critical moment in the US-Iran nuclear negotiations. According to the original plan, Iranian and American diplomats were supposed to hold the sixth round of nuclear talks on June 15 in Muscat, the capital of Oman. On June 11, Iran's foreign minister Araghchi posted a message directed at Trump. He claimed that Iran shouldn't possess nuclear weapons. Actually, this is consistent with Iran's own principles, and both the US and Iran can use this as a basis to reach an agreement that benefits both sides. But it's clear that Israel wants to use the attack to stop the US and Iran from reaching a deal.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a statement denying US involvement in the attack and warning Iran against targeting US interests or personnel in the region.
But from the fact that the US withdrew the families of its consulate staff in the Middle East one day before the attack, you can tell that the US already knew in advance that Israel was going to launch the attack. Perhaps after this incident and the bombing, Iran has already announced its withdrawal from the US-Iran nuclear talks. Iran has fallen into this predicament, and the country is filled with pro-US moderate voices. After years of US sanctions, Iran's struggling economy has made many people start to think about getting in. As long as Khamenei and his faction remain hardliners, the elected president keeps shifting between the pro-US camp and the hardliners. Last year, when President Pezeshkian took office, he was seen as part of the pro-US camp. Mainland Chinese social media even praised him quite a lot. They said that Iran's current tragic situation also serves as a warning bell for China. For China, Iran's experience is like a mirror, telling us that any sign of weakness during a war will only invite the fiercest attacks from the enemy. There's an old Chinese saying, better to live standing than die kneeling. This perfectly sums up Iran's fate. If you think you can survive by kneeling, in reality, there's no such chance. To understand why Iran refuses to accept the demands of the US and Israel, we have to go back to the Islamic Revolution 40 years ago. Back then, religious leader Khomeini led the masses to overthrow the pro-American Shah's regime, so in many people's minds, Iran has always been an anti-American fighter. But is that really the whole story? Over the past few decades, Iran has actually had several presidents who were more pro-Western. Besides the current president, Ebrahim Raisi, there was Rouhani, who signed the Iran nuclear deal with US President Obama in 2015, and also Rafsanjani. And also Khatami, who was also part of Iran's moderate camp. These pragmatic presidents all have something in common. They admire foreign ministers, try to avoid conflicts with the US and Western countries, and focus on economic reforms and pushing for the privatization of state-owned enterprises. They believe that, after doing this, the US and Western countries would accept Iran and let Iran join the civilized world. Among these people, Khatami was the most typical example. He was even recognized by Iranians as the most pro-American president in history, and this was soon after he took office. Iran was willing to open its airspace, making it easier for the US Air Force to launch attacks on Afghanistan. But the US government still labeled Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, adding it to the so-called Axis of Evil list of countries, and this happened right after the 9/11 attacks. There was a lot of pent-up anger in the US with nowhere to vent, so Bush just shut the door and insisted on going head-to-head. By calling Iran part of the axis of evil, the US directed its hostility towards that country, which eventually pushed the Iranian people to the breaking point. They ended up electing Ahmadinejad, a well-known hardline anti-American figure, as president. During his term, he strongly supported Iran's efforts to develop nuclear weapons. At that time, Israel already had nuclear arms, so for Iran, having nukes was seen as a matter of national survival to counter Israel. However, Ahmadinejad's anti-American actions triggered a comprehensive economic blockade from the US and the West. The same scenario kept repeating itself, and after that, Presidents Rouhani and Raisi also played along again, hoping that in this back-and-forth process, the only thing that never changed was that the US had never really intended to compromise. To get into Iran, no matter how much the Iranian president tries to give in, the US is actually never prepared to let Iran surrender. The reason behind this is that the US needs to create an enemy to justify declaring a regional threat and to control Middle Eastern oil resources. With the distance between Iran and the US, whether in terms of national ideology, economic or military strength, Iran is just the right fit to be America's enemy. According to public records, every US president and member of Congress has defined Iran as an enemy. In Iran, from the supreme leader down to the top levels of government, there is indeed a group of conservatives who still hold firmly to the beliefs from the time of the Islamic Revolution. However, every time they take a tough stance against the US, they always face opposition from the moderate faction within the country. At the same time, the main reason the US and Israel keep making things difficult for Iran is because it possesses enriched uranium, which could potentially be developed into nuclear weapons in the future. But most of the US's claims are based on suspicions or possibilities, yet they use this as the basis to fundamentally destroy Iran's ability to possess nuclear weapons. Because of ongoing internal turmoil, Iran has been hesitant and indecisive about responding strongly to the Gaza conflict, and as a result, it has ended up being pushed back step by Israel. So, the first conclusion is about Iran's domestic situation. There's always been a pro-America faction inside Iran wanting to reconcile with the US, and that has become Iran's weakness. With internal disunity, their external stance keeps swinging between tough and weak, which has allowed Israel to spot their weakness and infiltrate Iran. Now, the goal of the US and Israel is to overthrow the current Iranian regime, trying to turn Iran into another Syria with an anti-government movement. As for China, its tough approach towards the US is the way to go. This is exactly what China means by, if you're going to fight, you have to throw real punches, otherwise it's just wasted effort. If you're afraid the US will think you're too tough, don't worry, just see things clearly. In reality, the US government is just a makeshift troop. Very soon, the US will have to start trade talks with Japan again. With China setting the precedent, Japan has toughened up as well.
Japan's chief tariff negotiator, Minister for Economic Revitalization, Ryosei Akazawa, said on June 13, before departing for the sixth round of US tariff talks, that Japan will insist on reviewing US tariff demands, reject partial deals, and aim for a comprehensive agreement both sides accept.
Earlier, Japanese media revealed that the US negotiation team is actually a makeshift group in complete chaos. Nikkei Asian Review reported that sources close to the Japan-US relations negotiations complained about US Treasury Secretary Basenda, Commerce Secretary Lutnick, and Representative Greer. They like to ask questions, but each holds different positions. During negotiations with Japan, they openly show disagreements, compete, and create chaos, making it hard for Japan to figure out the real intentions of the US. This insider revealed that during the last meeting between 3 US cabinet officials and Japan's chief negotiator, Ryosei Akazawa, the meeting was once paused, and a few of them even started debating among themselves right in front of the Japanese representatives. The insider said that sometimes, the 3 of them would also have private discussions separately. They put pressure on the Japanese side, demanding Japan make concessions. It's speculated these 3 senior US officials might be competing to win Trump's favor. A senior Japanese economic official said that in the current negotiations, there are 3 levels on the US side: staff, cabinet officials, and the president. There's a disconnect, and it seems like information isn't being shared, which leads to the Japanese side often having to repeat the same things to different US staff and officials. As for Trump, who has the final say on tariffs, his stance hasn't been made clear. It's really hard for Japan to figure things out. The US wants what, and what kind of concessions need to be made to reach an agreement? A Japanese official involved in the US negotiations said that before the US-Japan summit is held and before the 2 leaders make a decision, nothing can be decided. At the end of last month, when Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba had a phone call with Trump, it was confirmed that during the G7 summit, which will be held in Canada from June 15th to 17th, a face-to-face bilateral meeting will take place on the sidelines, with hopes of reaching an agreement as soon as possible. Based on the information revealed by Japanese officials, this is the summary. First, they did not recklessly impose a global tax, then announce a 90-day postponement, and then again announce another 90-day postponement. Instead, within those 90 days they managed to reach agreements with more countries and had much diplomatic negotiation. The Trump administration simply cannot handle you. So even when negotiating with Japan, an important property partner, the three main U.S. representatives did not coordinate well in advance. So the Japanese side first mentioned that the U.S. had no plan and could only passively wait for the other side to come up with a plan, which was an embarrassing situation. Second, no decision was made too casually, and it was completely up to Trump. This authoritarian decision-making meant the three U.S. representatives negotiated with Japanese officials, seeking concessions to claim credit before Trump. Third, U.S. superpower decisions lacked careful consideration and scientific review. It's very easy to make reckless decisions, which is extremely dangerous for both the U.S. and the whole world.